Well, he guessed it was like Vietnam veterans coming home from the war and being called baby killers, like getting, people using names against you. But if you read this from a Catholic perspective, you don't arrive at that conclusion at all. What you, I think, immediately think of is, obviously they were talking about the Eucharist. But others who hear that and they're not catechized, and they talk about drinking blood and receiving the body of, sounds like something yucky. So that was one rumor. It was kind of an accusation coming from the highest levels from Roman leaders. The other one is that we were engaged in incestuous acts, because constantly Christians are talking about loving your brother and sister. And for a Roman who were very promiscuous about a lot of sexual practices, I think, that sounded kind of questionable. But it's misunderstanding the language. So Justin Martyr, this is when the church was still kind of underground, he was a highly placed person in the Roman government. He said, maybe I'm the guy that could finally explain this to people. I'm high enough placed that I should be okay, and I'll just try to, for the first time, I'll make an attempt to detail what a Catholic liturgy is, what happens at the Mass. And once they understand, they won't be so afraid of us. And he also wrote, by the way, he would say, of all the citizens you have, who pays their taxes the most faithfully on time? It's Christians. Who are the ones who volunteer for public service, who volunteer when fires break out, who help the poor? You should want Christians as your citizens. We're the best. But after he finished describing, unfortunately, Martyr is not his last name. I don't know why we know him as Justin Martyr, but it's Justin, Martyr. So unfortunately, though he made a wonderful attempt, he was clubbed to death. He was murdered for that. But St. Paul here, in an early phase, he's trying apologetics. He's trying to present his ideology. And one of the techniques of apologetics is to take note of what people are already familiar with and try to incorporate it. So in this little passage, when he's at the Areopagus, it's the stadium where all of these ideas are presented, there's evidence in here, first of all, from 2 points in this brief passage. It just showed up that day, but it shows a little bit how literate he is, how widely read he is. He quotes 2 Athenian poets in this brief passage. So one of them is, in him I live and move and have my being. It's from verse 28. Yeah, in him we live and move and have our being. He is quoting from the poet Epimenides. That would be like saying, okay, I'm in America, I'm going to quote from, who would it be today? Probably singers. Madonna or Beyonce or some rapper or whatever, depending on the age group I'm talking to. He quotes that, and the next line he gives is, for we are indeed his offspring. It's a quote from another poet named Aratus. He also did a little sightseeing before this talk, and he noticed, he tried to present it in the most positive way. He says, you Athenians, I notice you're very interested in religion. Actually, there are statues of gods all over your city. And I even found one with what do you call it, a stand or a pedestal with nothing on it. And the plaque on it was to the unknown God. So intentionally, they even made a monument to the unknown God. And he said, I'm going to use that. So he goes back and said, I noticed you even have a pedestal to the unknown God. That's the God I am here to tell you about. Good news for you. You've been stalked by that forever. I can tell you about it. So he does. And he also speaks in a specific way to come at 2 popular philosophies that were present in Athens at the time. One was the Epicureans. The Epicureans who who had an issue with believing in the resurrection and afterlife and those kind of things. And the other was the Stoics. So you can see certain passages where he brings up things. The Stoics were, today when we use the word Stoic, we think of someone who's very unexpressive and serious and stiff, like a log. But Stoics were actually, they were very big into penance and believing that the body is not who we are. We're a spark. This body is just, unfortunately, the thing that's imprisoning my spark. And I can hope for one day when I'm free of it, when I dump it. That's not Catholic, because we say to be human is to have a body and a soul. We don't become angels. I sometimes run into Christians who describe death as getting your wings. Well, they may teach that, I don't know. But for us, an angel is a different species. You don't get your wings. You don't become an angel. You're still human. We say death is a temporary separation of the body and the soul, but we believe in the general resurrection. We believe your body and a glorified body and your soul will be reunited. They didn't think that way, so some of them took on very rigorous penances to try and discipline the body, but ultimately the other conclusion, if you think like this, is just to become a hedonist. To just say, well, since the body's not me, I don't really need moral theology. I'm just going to have as much pleasure as I can handle, and then eventually I'll die and I'll shed this body. So his speech, in parts, it touches on those differences of belief, and tries to make a case. I'll just read part of it here. So it says, so he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who chanced to be there. Some also of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers met him, and some said, what would this babbler say? See, they're kind of cocky. They have all the best academians that the world knows, so they're not so quickly impressed by a traveling scholar who looks poor and disheveled, you know. Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he preached Jesus and the resurrection. And they took hold of him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is which you present, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. He would later say in his, I forget which letter, but he uses the phrase, tickling your ears, for people who would, I guess you could say, they suffer from the vice of curiosity. They just want a new thing and another new thing and another new thing. Oh, you have a new thing. It's like try a new drug. Be entertained, but they're not really serious. They're not committed to anything, taking on some ideology. So they're like, hey, come tickle our ears. You say strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. That tells you a lot about the culture of Athens. What would be a place in the world today closest to Athens? Ashland. She says Ashland. Maybe. University towns. Yeah, Berkeley. Maybe Los Angeles. Ashbury. The Bay Area. A lot of California is coming up here. You know what? It's funny because I've heard it said many times that the proper name for the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians should be renamed the letter of St. Paul to the Californians. It's because there's so many similarities. So Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, and of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands. By the way, that line is very important. because I didn't go into detail, but one of the things the Epicureans believed, they were polytheists. They believed in many gods, but they were nature-based gods. So there's the tree god, the frog god, the rain god, the antelope god, the alligator god, whatever. They believed there were deities in nature. And he's saying, no, the God I'm here to talk to you about, he's not contained within creation like the ones you are familiar with. He made it all. He's over it all. So he does not live in shrines made by men, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. And he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. Yet he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold, or silver, or stone. Again, this is right to the Epicureans. A representation by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. Raising him from the dead, the idea of resurrection kind of flies in the face of the Stoics. It's an offensive idea to them because they want to be free of the body and the material world. But part of what he's saying touches on a thing we would say as Catholics, we talk about as natural law. He's kind of saying, you may have certain intuitions about religion, about a God, or you have at least a hunger in you to search for a deity. But you can know the God I'm talking about because he made everything. So if you observe it, if you notice in the universe, there is an ordered structure. It speaks of an intelligent design. It speaks of some higher person who has brought this all into being. And you can't, therefore, claim ignorance about it. If you're a careful observer of the world, you study the sciences, you should have that inclination to feel that. But now he's saying, I'm here to fill in the blanks too, because I'm going to tell you about Jesus, who came to give us more clarity, divine revelation. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So Paul went on from among them, but some men joined him and believed, among them Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Honestly, it sounds like he didn't do very well. If you can name them by name, not a lot of people converted there. Peter's first homily, 3,000 people baptized. This sounds like a handful of people. Everyone else is saying, come entertain us again next week. Same bad time, same bad channel on the Grand Ole Opry stage. So it's tough. To be honest, it's very similar to the world we are in today. People treat science like it's a religion. Sometimes we call it scientism. Even though science cannot explain very basic things, you can't measure human courage. Any way I know, you can't measure love. You can't measure hope. You just know there's an X factor about some people that in a great crisis, this one comes out on top and this one fails. Why? Why is there a difference? How can we predict it? Science can't know that. So we respect science as Catholics, but we say science has its own field of authority and discipline. And when it crosses over, it can know one kind of truth, but it cannot know all truth. That's where theology takes over, where science stops. So we run into that today, people not so impressed. I've often thought, if Jesus came today instead of 2,000 years ago, he came when he did because it was the right time, the perfect time, the fullness of time. But if he came today, he'd be on a YouTube channel, And people would watch them for a few days, I think, and then they would go the next thing. We're a lot like these Athenians. We're like, what's the next latest craze? What's the next fashion? I think it'd be kind of hard for them to break through the noise. We see so many movies with special effects and stuff. To see a miracle today, I imagine a lot of people would just go, pretty nice trick. Where's the next town you're going to? I'd like to see your full show. It's a challenge.
They said that. We want a sign.
Yeah.
Give us
Some
a sign.
things haven't
Give us
changed.
another sign.
Yeah. We'll go a little bit further in 18. Any comments about his soiree into Athens? Good? Okay. Then Paul goes on to Corinth. So presumably he meets up with Silas and Timothy and the others at Athens, and then they set out from there. So it says after this he left Athens, went to Corinth. Corinth is, if you look on a map, it's located right on an isthmus. It's southern Greece. There's sea access on both sides of the isthmus. There's also a land bridge. So there are land trade routes, sea trade routes, but it was famous as a city of ill repute. It would be, I guess the closest in America would be Las Vegas, or San Francisco, or New Orleans. But it was a city of pirates, so they weren't law-abiding people. It's where pirates hung out, prostitution, bars. It was a party town. But it was strategically located for trade. They decided they were going to go there also. It says here, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. I had to look up Pontus. Pontus is the southern shore of the Black Sea. So it would be Turkey. He was originally from modern-day Turkey. He meets this guy, and it says, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So there was Claudius by decree kicked actually just the Jews out of Rome. But in his mind, he couldn't tell the difference between Jew and Christian. They were the same. So all Jews and Christians were kicked out. They lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they were sent to the four winds by the decree, by executive order, just overnight. And so they probably went to every point of the compass, but since this was a pretty highly trafficked sea lane from Rome, this couple ends up in Corinth as probably the first place they could get off and stop. And he went to see them, and because he wasn't the same trade, he stayed with them. And they worked, for by trade they were tent makers. This is the first time we hear about St. Paul's trade. You know, they didn't have theologians exclusively doing theology as we do today. And still some small Bible churches insist that a pastor should have a regular day job. This weekend job would be to be a pastor. But his job was tent maker. They had things like guilds, labor guilds or unions for various industries, rope makers, sail makers, tent makers, cloth makers. So he meets up with people he knows, and they kind of have a little synergy together. It frees up Paul a little bit to preach more, because as a group now together they can collectively support one another and live together. So it works out for him. And what does he do in his free time? He argues in the synagogues on every Sabbath, persuading Jews and Greeks. Still going to the synagogues again. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with preaching, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he took out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." He's venting again. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man shall attack you or harm you. For I have many people in this city." Why would he have many people in the city? Think of it for a moment. Paul just got there, but God's telling him, "Man, I got a lot of people in this city." Why? Because the Christians were kicked out of Rome. So a lot of Christians have now descended to Corinth. They're probably hidden little cells, house churches of people. But this is the first time Paul gets a break from persecution. First time God's saying, I'm going to pamper you. I'm going to remove all that suffering for a time. I want you to stay here. You've been running from town to town. There's a riot, there's a riot, there's a riot. Finally here I'm telling you, you're going to be left alone. I tried to put myself in his shoes and say, wow, that would be such a new concept, such a relief. But these kind of things have to be tested by faith, you know. The very first thing out of the gate, he's verbally attacked and he's arrested. How's that fit in with God just saying, I'll make sure you're left alone? Right after that promise, he gets arrested. But what is the outcome of it? The local ruler just says, you know what? He probably has something to grind against this fellow who brings an accusation. The local ruler's named Gallio Proconsul. He's like governor of the region where Corinth is IKEA, not the Scandinavian furniture store. So he's the governor of IKEA, and it sounds like he's probably had run-ins with the local synagogue leaders before. There's one particular one, Sosthenes. There must have been multiple leaders of the synagogue because several of them, you know, Crispus was a ruler of the synagogue. We just read, and he became Christian. This guy, Sosthenes, is definitely a direct enemy of Paul, and he wants to stir up hardship and persecution against Paul. But instead of Paul being harmed or beaten, Sosthenes is beaten. So they have a little trial, but the local ruler decides to bring the accuser forward and beat him instead and teach him a lesson. So for that reason, for the first time ever, Paul can preach uninterrupted. There's really only two other times he experiences this, and one only halfway. In Ephesus is one, and in Rome when he's under house arrest. But we're told that because of this thing, he stops wandering. He's not a tumbleweed. He stays in Corinth for 1.5 years. That's a record. He's going several weeks and moving on, living on the road. Here he gets to stay and actually build something strong. But eventually, it says that after this 1.5 years, he departs from there. He feels it's time to go back home. This marks the end of the second missionary journey. And he even parts ways from Priscilla and Aquila. They are very good friends of his, but we're told they will eventually settle in Ephesus. So they leave this place and go to Ephesus and become part of the church there, whereas Paul goes to Jerusalem to report into the apostles. The last thing we'll say, and we'll conclude, is now we have another figure. We had Timothy, we had Lydia, we had Aquila and Priscilla, and the last all-star figure that is mentioned in this missionary trip is Apollos, a man named Apollos. Here's how he's described. Now a Jew, this is from verse 24 in chapter 18. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. By the way, there's some confusion in the timeline here, whether we're at the start now with the third missionary journey or the second, because it's talking about Paul leaving Corinth. And now it says this Apollos came to Ephesus, but he's from Alexandria, he's from Egypt. Egypt had a major theological school for the Jewish people. It was one of the major centers of theological thinking. And he's come over to this place, It says he was an eloquent man, a gifted speaker, well versed in scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. So his theological perspective is incomplete. He's very familiar with John the Baptist, but there's a lot of gaps in his understanding. Maybe he's not heard the full gospel. He knows maybe some key components. Jesus died and rose from the dead and stuff, but it's clear he's missing some of the things that Jesus taught. And it said he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him and expounded to him the way of God more accurately. So they pulled him aside kind of discreetly, maybe invited him home. They gave him a short course in theology for Christians. And then it says when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brethren encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to receive him. So they had this brief overlap, and then Priscilla and Aquila are settling in Ephesus. Paul will go to Jerusalem. Apollos will go to Corinth. That's where Achaia is. So they're just ships passing in the night. And he's recharged. He's got a spirit a little bit like St. Paul. He's like, I'm not your soldier. I'm doing my own thing. Thank you for the update. I have a 2.0 version of Christianity now. And he's back on his way again. He himself is a very capable scholar. Here's the last little piece of trivia I'll leave you with. One of the last books, there were several books that were last to be added to the New Testament when the church did add them. One of them was 2 Peter, I believe, because of how infrequently God is mentioned in that letter. James was one because it sounded kind of Jewish to some people's ears. But another one was the letter to the Hebrews. And notice when you look at that book, if you see it in your Bible, other books say a letter of St. Paul to the whoever's. Hebrews does not say a letter of St. Paul to the Hebrews. Because it is unanimously agreed that St. Paul did not write that. The theology is very different. But the number one theory by far about who the author was of Hebrews is Apollos. So if you want to know something of the mind of Apollos, in our church scholarship, we would suggest that author is Apollos. Very eloquent. It reads very differently. It's not a letter. I call it a theological treatise. It's like a theological paper you would write in seminary. It's explaining the Catholic priesthood, how the priesthood didn't come to an end. When the transition from Judaism happened. But there's a new order of priesthood. There's Jesus Christ, the high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek. With the new covenant and new law. So we'll stop there. Apollos is a very intriguing figure. We know very little about him. But we'll pick up next time on chapter 19 with Paul in Ephesus and see about what he runs into there. You'll know if you look up the 7 ancient wonders of the world, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was in Ephesus. It was the temple to Artemis. And the number one trade there was pilgrimage souvenirs made out of silver for pilgrims around the world coming to the temple of Artemis. Paul was so powerful and effective in his preaching the gospel that people stopped buying the souvenirs. And people stopped going to the temple. And the local silversmiths, the silver craftsmen were like, "You're wrecking our industry." And so they will set out to attack him. But that gives you a little measuring stick. It seems like this new Christian gospel is catching on like wildfire now. He's transforming the culture of Corinth and Ephesus. So we'll take a look at that next time. We'll just close with the prayer, and I will stick after for questions if people have. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without